There is an oil that costs only $2 to apply and makes any piece of wood completely waterproof. Not just water resistant, but truly waterproof. This applies to decks, fences, outdoor furniture, cabin walls, tool handles, and cutting boards. A single application penetrates deep into the grain, bonds at a molecular level, and hardens into a clear armor that repels water for life. If you pour water over a treated surface, it beads up and slides off like mercury on glass. The Chinese used it to waterproof entire naval fleets 2,500 years ago. The United States military even classified it as a strategic war material in 1941. Marco Polo wrote about it in the 13th century, after observing shipbuilders sealing ocean-going vessels with nothing but this oil, lime, and chopped hemp. Then in the 1930s, the chemical industry figured out how to synthesize something cheaper. Not better, just cheaper. They didn't stop using this oil because it failed. They stopped talking about it because it worked too well and cost too little. A $2 bottle of oil that permanently waterproofs wood cannot sell $40 gallons of sealer that peel and crack every 2 years. What cannot generate repeat purchases cannot generate profit. This is the story of the oldest wood finish on earth and how a $12 billion coatings industry made sure you never knew its name. Around 400 BC, a philosopher named Confucius wrote about an oil pressed from the seeds of a tree with heart-shaped leaves in southern China. The tree was the tongue, and the oil it produced would change the course of civilizations for 25 centuries. Chinese artisans discovered that when tongue oil was spread over virgin wood and left to cure in the open air, it didn't just sit on the surface. It soaked deep into the wood fibers, penetrating the grain at a cellular level, and then did something no other oil could do. It polymerized. Exposure to oxygen triggered a chain reaction that transformed the liquid oil into a solid, clear, and flexible polymer locked inside the wood, not a layer sitting on top. It was a molecular shield fused into the wood from the inside out. The result was a surface that completely repelled water while simultaneously allowing the wood to breathe. Moisture couldn't get in, but trapped moisture could still escape, preventing the rot and warping that destroy wood from the inside out. By the Song dynasty, approximately 960 to 1279 AD, Chinese shipbuilders were coating entire hulls with tung oil. Ocean-going vessels called junks crossed the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, reaching the coast of East Africa with hulls that survived years of immersion in saltwater. No synthetic sealer, no fiberglass, no epoxy. Just nut oil pressed from a tree that grew wild in the hills. When Marco Polo arrived in China in the 1270s, he documented what he witnessed. He wrote that the Chinese took lime, chopped hemp, and a certain wood oil, and that when the three were combined, they held like any glue. That particular wood oil was tung, but tung oil wasn't the only weapon in the ancient waterproofing arsenal. Across Europe, a parallel discovery had been developing for centuries with linseed oil pressed from the seeds of the flax plant. Renaissance painters used it as a base for their pigments, and shipwrights along the Baltic coast rubbed it into oak planks before launching vessels into the North Sea. The combination of both oils was devastating. Linseed oil penetrated deep, conditioning the wood fibers from within. Tung oil hardened on top, creating the waterproof polymer barrier. Together, they formed a defense system that no synthetic product has ever managed to replicate. For centuries, this was simply how you protected wood. Your great-grandparents knew it. Every farm in rural America had a can of boiled linseed oil and a jar of tung oil on the workshop shelf. Fence posts treated with these oils in the 1920s are still standing in parts of Virginia and the Carolinas. The knowledge was everywhere. Then something changed. In 1926, DuPont chemists developed the first practical oil-modified alkyd resin, a synthetic polyester that could mimic some properties of natural drying oils, but was made in an industrial-scale factory. By the early 1930s, alkyd-based coatings began replacing pure linseed and tung oil finishes in both architectural and industrial applications. The pitch was simple: faster drying, smoother finish, more consistent. What they didn't advertise was that alkyd coatings sat on the surface of the wood like a plastic film. They didn't penetrate the grain. They didn't become part of the wood. They cracked, they peeled, they failed. And when they failed, you had to buy more. By 1935, the shift was nearly total. Hardware stores that once kept pure tung oil and linseed oil on the front shelf began pushing cans of synthetic varnish instead. The profit margin on a 40-cent bottle of natural oil that lasted a decade was nothing compared to a $4 can of sealer that needed to be reapplied every 18 months. Natural oils didn't disappear because they stopped working. They disappeared because they worked so well that no one needed to buy more. What you are about to discover is but a small fraction of something much deeper. For years, I have gathered information that the outdoor industry would prefer you never see, and I have organized it into a comprehensive archive that reveals practical knowledge, forgotten techniques, and systems that have been systematically ignored or discarded. Here you won't just find interesting ideas, but real solutions. Fire-starting methods used by military units that are today considered too dangerous for the public, emergency shelter designs that cost practically nothing yet outperform high-priced tents, and homemade water filtration systems that even engineers have tested with skepticism, until verifying that they actually work. Included within this collection is also a complete off-grid energy system capable of eliminating dependence on utility bills, a 72-hour blackout survival checklist designed to protect a family when everything fails, a cookbook titled Lost Rations with foods that can be stored for years without spoilage, and a firecraft manual that gathers techniques from 17 different cultures. This collection continues to grow constantly, and current access will not be available forever. The link is in the description, but stay here, because the truly important part is just beginning. Now it's time to look at the data that the coatings industry would prefer to keep hidden. Tung oil contains approximately 69% alpha eleosteric acid, a fatty acid characterized by 3 conjugated double bonds in its carbon chain. This molecular structure is what makes it exceptional. When it comes into contact with oxygen in the air, these bonds react and create an extremely dense, interconnected, and stable polymeric network. The result is not simply a water-resistant layer, but a virtually waterproof barrier. This phenomenon was extensively documented by the United States Forest Products Laboratory in the 1930s and 1940s, where it was proven that cured tung oil offered water resistance superior to any other known natural drying oil. However, this is where the numbers start to get uncomfortable for the industry. A quart of pure tung oil costs between $12 and $18 and can cover around 150 square feet of wood through several thin coats. An average deck of 300 to 400 square feet can be treated completely with barely 2 quarts, representing a maximum cost of nearly $36. In contrast, a commercial synthetic sealer costs between $35 and $50 per gallon, covering a similar surface area with a single coat, although manufacturers recommend applying 2. That raises the initial expense to between $70 and $100, even before starting the job. But the most important detail appears in the fine print. These products require reapplication every 1 to 3 years. Over a 10-year period, the total cost can easily rise to between $350 and $1,000. In contrast, tung oil doesn't sit on the surface waiting to fail. It penetrates the wood, integrates into its structure, and offers lasting protection for years. It doesn't crack, it doesn't flake, it doesn't peel. If you've made it this far, you already understand more about wood protection than most homeowners, and that completely changes how you see these products. But the story gets even more interesting when we look toward the past. In 1905, an agricultural explorer from the United States Department of Agriculture introduced seeds from the tung tree from China. The potential was evident from the start. By 1912, the government was already incentivizing farmers to grow these trees, even offering free seedlings. In 1927, Florida had over 10,000 acres planted, and by 1938, the so-called tung belt stretched from Florida to Texas with approximately 200,000 acres. Tung oil was abundant, inexpensive, and superior to any synthetic alternative. In 1941, during the war, it was declared a strategic resource. It was used in munitions, in coatings for ships, and in military machinery. The government knew perfectly well how effective this material was. However, after the war, the situation changed radically. The chemical industry had invested huge amounts in synthetic resins and was not willing to abandon those investments. Large corporations began to flood the market with artificial alternatives and cheaper imported oil, progressively displacing local producers. Between 1955 and 1970, national consumption fell by nearly 50%. Subsequently, devastating hurricanes destroyed many remaining plantations, and farmers, supported by federal compensation, definitively abandoned the crop. By the early 1970s, the tung oil industry in the United States had practically disappeared, not because the product stopped working, but because it stopped being convenient for the dominant economic system. Today, the global wood coatings market generates more than $12 billion annually. Companies like Sherwin-Williams, PPG, AkzoNobel, and BASF dominate this sector. The most common products, such as polyurethanes, create a surface layer that over time cracks under UV radiation and peels when moisture penetrates underneath. And when that happens, the consumer buys again. Tung oil, on the other hand, cannot be patented, nor can it be reformulated to generate constant recurring revenue. It is a natural, simple, effective product, and that is precisely why it doesn't fit into a model based on repeat purchases. Therefore, what was durable was replaced by what was profitable. If you decide to use tung oil, make sure to buy a 100% pure version. Avoid blends or products labeled tung oil finish, as they usually contain a minimal actual amount combined with synthetic solvents. The word pure must appear clearly on the label. If you see ingredients like mineral spirits, naphtha, or alkyd resins, it's better to avoid it. For the first coat, dilute the oil in a 1:1 ratio with a natural solvent like turpentine or citrus solvent. This will allow the oil to penetrate deep into the wood fibers. Apply it generously, let it absorb for 15 to 30 minutes, and wipe away the excess. Wait 24 to 48 hours before applying the next coat. The second coat can have a higher ratio of oil, and the third should be applied completely pure. In total, 3 coats provide deep and lasting protection. The resulting finish will have a warm, slightly golden tone with a satin sheen that highlights the natural beauty of the wood without giving it an artificial look. It's important to understand that this process requires patience. Each coat needs time to cure, and full curing can take up to 30 days. However, once finished, the result can last for years without the need for frequent reapplication. The modern industry prioritizes speed because speed leads to shorter purchase cycles. Tung oil, on the other hand, requires time but rewards with durability. For centuries, entire civilizations understood this balance. From ancient philosophers to shipbuilders, everyone valued permanence over immediacy. This knowledge never truly disappeared. It simply stopped being promoted, and now it is once again within reach of anyone willing to see it.